Welcome to the Athlete Insights Podcast, hosted by Yash Padday, a podcast focused on letting athletes tell their journeys in their sport. This podcast is presented by Boxed Water. Boxed water is better.
Welcome into another episode of the Athlete Insights Podcast. Today I've got my guest, Dr. Jess Dixon, who's a professor of sport management at the University of Windsor in Canada. So, Professor Dixon, thank you so much for taking the time and joining me today. I know it's a Friday, so I appreciate you taking the time, cutting into your weekend time a little bit, and spending some time and talking with me today.
All good. Thanks for having me on the podcast, Josh. And I am on sabbatical, but trying to fit this in has been a little bit more complicated than we first thought.
No, for sure. But I appreciate you bearing with me and being on. And so I like to with my guests, I like to start, like I said, I start from the beginning and I kind of work through your career and go through that process. So I want to kind of start with yourself and your beginnings. And when you really, when was your first, when did you first fall in love, you can say, with sport? And what was your really, the time when you really sparked your interest in sport specifically?
Great question and a great place to start because it's been such an influence on so many things in my life.
Yeah.
My love for sports started when I was very young. My dad played sports recreationally, but came from a kind of a poor upbringing and never really had the opportunity to engage in a lot of structured sport
Hmm.
experiences. A lot of his experiences were recreational or through school.
Hmm.
But he always liked sports. And so, when he was working and could afford it, he started playing hockey and baseball and so forth. And so, some of my youngest memories, childhood memories, were at the ballpark, chasing down foul balls for my dad's team and, playing catch with the guys before the game. And he stopped playing hockey a little bit earlier, so I don't have as many memories of that.
Hmm.
But I do remember going to the arena and, him having a pretty heavy slap shot. And, some of the guys stayed away from that, from blocking it. But so, my youngest memories were sport, were very positive. And it meant spending time with my dad and my mom, who was there dragging my younger brother and I around to the ball diamond or the hockey arena when we were young. And so I started playing baseball when I was 6, and I started doing hockey, started playing skating lessons probably around the same time, but I didn't start playing hockey until a little bit later on. I was closer to 9 years old when I started playing hockey. But thoroughly enjoyed both of them. Played them you know, at a younger age, mostly at the house league level. But then, as I started developing skills, started playing on some travel teams. And, when I got into high school, I ended up playing on the high school baseball team, started the high school baseball team, actually. Interesting story there.
Okay.
Played on the high school hockey team as well, and as well as the high school golf team.
Hmm.
And, golf sort of came in later. My dad started getting into golf as, probably as he was getting into his, mid 30s and late 30s. And I would go and caddy for him at the club where he was a member. And, I didn't really do a whole lot of, clean the balls and,
Yeah.
you know, grab a towel for him when I needed it or when he needed it or whatever the case may be. I used to love driving the cart. Um, but yeah, same thing. Like just hanging around with my dad and with his buddies and that sort of stuff. I eventually took a liking to golf. And in high school, I started working at a retail sporting goods store where I was sharpening hockey skates and selling hockey equipment and baseball equipment, and helping teams with their uniform requirements.
Hmm.
And I would do that during the fall and winter months. And in the summer, I started working at a golf course. And so I was always around sports.
Yeah.
And then as in high school, where I grew up, which was in Stony Creek, which is kind
Hmm.
of halfway between Niagara Falls and Toronto, we didn't have a high school baseball team at that time. And so me and a couple of buddies said, well, why don't we? Other high schools do. We should have one too. And
Yeah.
we had a lot of really good ball players at our school. And so we took it upon ourselves to get it started. We met with the principal of the high school and said, here's what we want to do. We used my connections with the sporting goods store to get discounts on the uniforms and the balls, and we got some sponsors and negotiated things with the city to get park time, our field time, so we could practice and play our games. And one of the parents became our coach, and as
There
far
you
as
go.
I know, that team is still going. But that was sort of my first, apart from working these part-time jobs, that was sort of my first time doing sport management like stuff.
Hmm. And
And yeah,
you,
so that sort of springboarded everything from there.
yeah, and you talk about so baseball was kind of your
Baseball was number
first
one.
foray, and
Yeah.
then yeah, like hockey, and then you got into golf and other things. And you mentioned your high school experience being super positive, and we have from what you were talking there drew a connection. I also worked at a golf course in high school and during COVID, so it kind
Yeah.
of
It's a great place to work.
a great place to work, you know.
It really is.
Golf
Everybody's
great.
there in a good mood because
Yeah,
they're,
yeah.
they're getting out
And
and
the
getting
free
some
golf
fresh air.
helps, you know. So
Yeah. No, it's good. Meet all kinds of really cool people.
yeah, no, it's great. And it's been a blessing in my life, I'm sure for yourself as well. And
So
um talk about, I know you went to the University of Windsor, and then did that, and then you got your doctorate from UMass as well. But can you
yeah.
talk about your collegiate year, your undergraduate year specifically, and how sport impacted your undergraduate years as well?
I can. So when I was coming out of high school, again, I knew I was interested in sport and physical activity. I had some really great high school physical education teachers who I really admired.
Mhm.
And I thought that's what I wanted to do, was become a high school phys ed teacher. And so I enrolled in the physical education program at Brock University. That's where I did my undergraduate degree.
Mhm.
And I didn't know that sport management was a thing.
Yeah.
It didn't really exist in Canada at that time. And where it did, it was hidden as like a major or a minor within other programs. It wasn't really a standalone degree program at that point.
Gotcha.
So, I thought, well, what a great life I could have as a high school phys ed teacher. And so that was the path that I was going to go. And so I did. I went to Brock University. I enrolled in that program. And when I got there, I didn't really love the program, but I did make it as a walk-on with the university baseball team,
Yeah.
and so I was playing varsity baseball. We made it to a national championship that year, lost in the finals, but it was a great first experience. Met some really great friends and really enjoyed university life.
Mhm.
But the phys ed program was just not for me. And I got really lucky in the winter term, probably sometime in February. The dean came into one of our first year classes and said, we're going to start a new program in sport management. And
Mhm.
if you're in phys ed and you want to transfer into it, you can transfer in without losing your standing as long as you met a minimum grade threshold. I
Oh.
met the minimum grade threshold, but I really didn't know what sport management was. And so I remember going to set up a meeting with the dean and ask, like, what is this sport management? Like, I've been doing these part-time jobs and I had this experience in high school with the baseball team, but is that what sport management is? I really didn't know at that point.
Yeah.
And he was honest. He's like, look, I really don't know a whole lot about it, but it's really taken off in the US, and
Mhm.
we're gonna invest in it. We're gonna make it something special here at Brock. And
Yeah.
it sounds like the experiences you've had would lend themselves well to you being successful in that program. And so I kind of took a leap of faith and switched over into sport management, and that just kind of became my call for the rest of my academic career. My grades immediately shot up.
Yeah.
The assignments that I was doing didn't really feel like work. They were fun. I enjoyed
Yeah.
learning about, everything that I was watching on TV or reading about in books. And but it was very, very much in its infancy. By the time I graduated from that program, I think there were two full-time faculty members. Now at Brock, I think there's close to 25 faculty members. It's one of the
Yeah.
largest programs in the entire world.
Yeah.
Um, but at the time, it was still very much in its infancy, and I felt that I just didn't know enough because we were borrowing courses from all across campus to kind of put this hodgepodge of a program together.
Yeah.
And I felt like I just need to learn more. And that's where I decided to pursue a master's degree. And that ultimately led me to the University of Windsor. I had a very positive experience. The people who were my professors at Windsor had a very big role in the founding of the North American Society for Sport Management and introduced me to those circles and got to know some really influential people within the field. And my plan initially was to go there and do an internship somewhere and then go work in industry.
Yeah.
But somewhere in my first semester, I got talked into maybe going a different path. And I'll give my former thesis advisor, Bob Boucher, a lot of credit for helping me see, academia as a career path, as a viable career path, because at that point I didn't really think of it that way. And it made a lot of sense when, I think back to some of the things he was saying. I initially went to university to become a teacher. That
Mhm.
was my passion, but there's no high school sport management. So if I was going to do it, it was going to have to be at a different level.
Yeah.
I didn't really know much about research. And, he said, well, if you're gonna do this, you're gonna have to learn about research. So you might want to think about doing a thesis instead of the internship. Those were the sort of the two pathways.
Gotcha.
And so again, I took a leap of faith and said, all right, let's try this. And so I did a thesis and I really enjoyed it. I got to present at the NASM conference on 2 occasions while I was a master's student.
Mhm.
Those were very positive. Got a lot of positive reinforcement from people who I met at the NASM conference.
Yeah.
And then, as I was getting toward the end of my studies, I got a call from some of my colleagues at Brock saying, hey, we're growing. We need some people to teach some classes. Would you be willing to come and help us?
Yeah.
That's Lucy.
Oh, there you go.
And so anyway, I ended up going back to Brock.
Mhm.
I ended up going back to Brock and I taught there for 2 years. And that sort of reinforced to me that was the career path that I wanted to go. I finished up my thesis and then I started meeting with people from mostly the US, but not exclusively the US, about doing my PhD.
Okay.
And that eventually led me to UMass. My experiences in Canada were within sort of a health studies, human kinetics type of environment.
Mhm.
And I wanted to get a little bit more of a business orientation to my understanding of sport. And at that point, there weren't that many PhD programs within a business school. UMass was just moving into the Eisenberg School of Management.
Mhm.
And I also wanted to get the US experience. Sport in Canada is very different. Our university systems are very different, in terms of intercollegiate university or intercollegiate athletics. The opportunities in professional sport, it's a much smaller industry. Our sports systems are different at the amateur level in terms of how they're funded and everything else. So I just wanted to get a different perspective, and that's what drew me ultimately to the University of Massachusetts. And I spent 3 years there, loved every minute of it, soaked in as much as I could,
Mhm.
took a whole bunch of extra classes that I never got exposed to at the undergraduate or master's level, just so I could learn. And then the University of Windsor came calling and said, "Hey, we're going to have a job opening, or might you be interested?" And so after 3 years at UMass, I went back to Windsor as a young assistant professor, ABD to begin with, and then finished up my PhD by the end of my first year, or as I was finishing up my first year. And that was 18 plus years ago.
Wow, I'm as you're talking, I'm drawing a lot of parallels as to kind of how I've been, and you mentioned you had a mentor at Windsor that really helped you see a viable career path in academia, and it's the same for me. I was getting my master's degree at Memphis, and my mentor and advisor, Dr. Cody Havard, I'll shout him out too.
Yep.
He really helped me see that a PhD was viable, and my years in Northern Colorado were great and built a lot of good relationships as you. So I've seen I'm drawing a lot of parallels as
Sounds like it.
you're talking on kind of how that's and it's great to see that. And want to now kind of talk about your research and what
Mhm.
you said, when you first started, you didn't really know too much about it and you had to learn about it, and kind of now you've published quite a bit of articles, and I've read through some of them really good, and I really enjoyed reading through your articles and looking through your articles. And so can you talk about for those that viewers and listeners that might not know about the research that you do. Can you briefly kind of describe the type of research that you do and your research in general?
Sure. So, my PhD dissertation is in the area of strategic management, and so that's the area that that's my primary base. Within the context of professional sports
Mhm.
is sort of where I go to, um, and that's where I do some of my teaching as well. But the reality is, in Canada, um, our federal granting agencies really don't want to support research that's going to help wealthy people just make more money. And so, one of the expectations of faculty members in Ontario, anyway, or at least at the University of Windsor, is that you have funding to support your research and, to bring on graduate students and to help support them with their development. And so that I can mentor them to have the same kind of opportunities that I had and you had, it sounds like,
Mhm.
during our master's degrees and PhDs.
Yeah.
Um, so I had to kind of come up with, all right, how am I going to get funding for my research? And I was sharing this with somebody just yesterday about how that all came to be, and it really started with kind of a hallway conversation with a colleague. I just finished reading Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers,
Mhm.
and in the opening chapter, he talks about something known as the relative age effect.
Yeah.
And this was right around the time where our local junior Ontario Hockey League franchise was winning national championships, called the Memorial Cup.
Uh,
And so the Windsor Spitfires were having a lot of success. And my colleague, who was across the hall from me, Sean Horton, had written sort of an editorial in the local newspaper about the relative age effect within the roster of the Windsor Spitfires. And
mm,
so for those who aren't aware of what the relative age effect is, it has to do with when you're born during the year and how that impacts the kinds of experiences you have growing up in sports. It's also very prevalent within education. And
mhm.
so what happens is we group our athletes or our students at young ages based on their chronological age.
Yeah.
They're usually grouped according to a year. And so the year can be a calendar year. It could be, January 1st to December 31st. In some states or provinces, it may be September 1st through to October 31st.
Yeah.
Um, but anyway, there's a cohort year. And what the research shows is those who are born within the first, 3 to 6 months of that cohort
Mhm.
have significant advantages over those born in the latter 6 months. And
Okay.
it has to do with development, right? If you're, I mentioned my own hockey and baseball experiences started at 6 years of age.
Mhm.
At 6 years of age, the difference between somebody born in January, let's say, and somebody born in December is pretty significant,
Yeah.
right? It's 15 to 20% age difference.
Mhm.
It's quite substantial.
Yeah.
And so if we are, if we're a coach of a youth team
Yeah.
and we're putting together a tournament team or a travel team or something like that, and we have an open tryout
Mhm.
for athletes that are U6 or U7 or U8 or whatever the age category is going to be,
Mhm.
the athletes that are born closer to that cutoff date are going to look like they're more talented. But the reality is they're just older, they're stronger, they're faster, they're more coordinated. They can mentally process things a lot better.
Mhm.
Generally, this is not a hard and fast rule, but generally, they're more advanced in their development.
Yeah.
And so they get selected to these teams. And then once they're in those teams, they get better coaching most of the time. They
Mhm.
get more opportunities for practice and for play. They're
Gotcha.
playing against better competition. And so then it just sort of reinforces itself. It becomes this, the self-fulfilling prophecy. But the reality is they were just a little bit older at a
Yeah.
very young age.
Mhm.
And so those who are born later in the year, they don't get those same opportunities. They continue to play at the house league level,
Yeah.
or at the regional level. They don't get the opportunity to get the better coaching. And so a lot of them end up dropping out of sport
Mhm.
altogether before they ever get the chance to really see how good they might be.
Yeah.
Um, and so I was having this conversation with my colleague. I'm like, hey, I was born in November. I was one of those people that was disadvantaged in hockey and baseball. I really didn't start to develop as an athlete. Fortunately, I had positive experiences and didn't drop out of those sports.
Mhm.
But, I was late maturing, even in high school. Like I didn't start, a growth spurt until much later on. And so um, I really didn't have some of those opportunities that, some of my classmates and fellow hockey players and baseball players may have had at a younger age.
Yeah.
Um, and it also applies in schools.
Yeah.
Students that are born at the later parts of the year are more likely to be misdiagnosed with ADHD or some other type of learning disability. Those that are born earlier in the year are more likely to have, be eligible to skip a grade or be put into a some type of elite program. They're more likely to be captains of their varsity teams, student council presidents, and it just goes on and on. So anyway, we started talking about, this phenomenon, relative age effects, and
Hmm.
how it sort of materializes in sport and what causes it. And we started having some conversation. He has a late birthday. I have a late birthday. We started talking about how it impacted us.
Yeah.
And we're like, well, it worked out well for us. Like, how did we overcome it? Like, and how can we create
Something.
change to ensure that other people still have a positive experience in sport?
Yeah.
And so that became the basis for a lot of my research. I've had now three consecutive federal research grants supporting different aspects of this. The first one was looking at the relationship between relative age effect and leadership development
Hmm.
in
Yeah.
sport. We specifically looked at youth hockey players, published a number of papers there. We looked at it within the context of university athletics in Canada, and what happens when athletes redshirt, for instance. What happens when athletes enter into university? They do a victory lap of high school. They come into university a year late. So
Hmm.
now they're a year older than everybody else
Yeah.
that they're competing with for roster spots. Is that fair? Do we need to
Incorporate.
restructure our sports system? So then it got me, from a management standpoint, got me thinking about, policy decisions and coming back to my strategic management. Like, okay, these are decisions that we are making within our education systems and our sports systems
Yeah.
to structure it in such a way that is creating these disadvantages.
Yeah.
And it's,
So how can we restructure, like you said, how can we restructure our education system to really equalize that out?
well, my focus is more on the sports system, but
Yeah.
if we can
Yeah.
find something in sport,
Yeah. Yeah.
because let's face it, sport is something that we can choose to do,
Yeah. Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
If I don't want to play hockey or baseball as a kid, and
Have to.
hopefully my parents don't force me to do it,
Yeah.
but our social structures are set up that, we have to go to school. We are obligated to stay there until we're 18 or whatever the case may
Yeah.
be.
Yeah.
That's where we see, this is going to sound like a real downer, but uh, higher instances of youth incarceration and teen and youth suicide from those who are relatively younger. So very, very serious consequences here associated with this effect.
Yeah.
And nobody has come up with a real easy solution to the problem.
Yeah.
But if we can find something in sport, then maybe
We can
there's something
connect
that
it
can
to,
transfer into education.
yeah. So and that's the beauty of like going through your stuff and going through some of your stuff on Google Scholar and your articles, like how much of an industry, how well you can connect some, like a lot of your research to the industry, and what you've done has been wonderful to see in that regard. And obviously, like you said, your sport experiences were positive. Things are positive. You're trying to connect that to other young people, and I see a little bit of that in that stuff. But what are some challenges? Like and I see like a lot of jobs now, and in academia, a lot of ask on external funding, grant funding, all that stuff. And you mentioned that's kind of what the country and the Ontario really expected out of you. But what's the biggest challenge that you faced in terms of in your research, and in terms of funding as well, and gaining funding?
Hmm. Well, I mean, I think one of the things is there's just so many competing priorities, right? If it's a government agency, whether it's at the state or provincial level or at the federal level,
Yep.
um, you know, sport versus education versus health versus, the social issues,
Mhm.
infrastructure, um, trying to convince people that this research in sport is important.
Yep.
Important in terms of people's physical health, their mental health, their social health,
Gotcha.
and that it can make a difference in people's lives that they carry over into other aspects of
Mhm.
them being, positive citizens in our communities.
Yeah.
I think that's something that, some people in the sport related um, the research areas struggle with, right? I'm in a kinesiology department,
Mhm.
and some of our, if I take ergonomics, right, or biomechanics,
Yeah.
a lot of people, at least in Canada, my understanding is that the support systems in parts of Europe are a little bit better for funding sport science research.
Mhm.
But a lot of people have had to, deviate away from studying sport biomechanics
Mhm.
because there's no funding tied to it. And they're taking that knowledge and they're applying it to manufacturing. So they're working with, big three automakers, or they're working with, the agricultural sector and trying to find ways to help keep employees healthy as opposed to keeping athletes healthy.
Yeah.
And then, that's where the funding comes from. And then sport becomes sort of the passion project where they can take what they're learning in these other industry applications and
Mhm.
kind of write a little bit about the sport applications on the side.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And when you look at your research and when you obviously, like I said, there's a lot, there's a great industry, there's a great connection to the industry and to like the world, and how you're pursuing your research, and it's great to see what you're doing, and kind of how the impact that you're having, and that you will have in the future. But where do you see kind of your research in the future? Like, what do you, can you give us a glimpse of like what you're planning on doing in the future with research, and kind of what you plan to continue to do with your research?
Yeah, so specific to the relative age research that I'm working on,
Yeah.
we have a small grant right now where we're working with an industry partner where we're
Okay.
working on um, empirically testing one of the the ways that have been proposed to help mitigate relative age effects.
Uh,
And so we are actually it's an experimental design. We're working with hockey scouts. That's one of our partners is a scouting agency,
yeah.
and we're looking at the way that information is shared with them about the ages of the athletes, whether that impacts how they perceive their quote unquote talent,
Hmm.
or their skills within the sport. I think talent is sort of becoming a, you know, uh, not necessarily the right word to capture what we're seeing or what we're observing, right?
Gotcha. Yeah.
Um, so depending on the outcome of that research, and we're anticipating positive things, is to build that out, working with additional partners, working with our national sport governing bodies and professional sport governing bodies to now roll that out on a maybe on a provincial scale or on a national scale in different sports and see if we can replicate the findings. And if we do, then it's one small thing that we can incorporate
Mhm.
into talent identification
Yeah.
processes to help mitigate and reduce the relative age effect.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And do you see, and I know like there's a lot of emerging tech and AI. I mean, AI is impacted everybody now, in terms of how it's getting. How do you see that, and kind of the emergence of this different, like AI, for example, we're talking about? How do you see that impacting your research in the future, if I can ask?
It's a great question. I haven't really given that a whole lot of thought. I'm spending a lot of my time thinking about how AI is going to impact my teaching more
Gotcha.
than my
Yeah.
research. But um, I think in terms of grant writing, I think it's going to help me in calling together research and
Mhm.
maybe helping to identify gaps within that research.
Yeah.
Helping me see gaps and things that maybe I'm
Missing.
I'm not seeing in my own, look at the literature.
Yeah.
So I think from those standpoints, it can be really helpful. I'm seeing maybe some opportunities in terms of big data and analyzing big data and pulling together, um, data sets in ways that I've never, that I might not have access to or might not have the person power or the time to kind of analyze and get through. So, um, especially if we're working with some of these larger organizations, you're going to be working with,
Mhm.
potentially hundreds of thousands of participants and, cleaning some of those data and trying to identify some of the trends within it to understand what does the relative age effect look like in sport A versus sport B versus sport C, because
Yeah.
how we might want to go about, introducing some of these mitigation strategies might be entirely different.
Yeah.
But it's a great question. I'm still scratching the surface on some of those topics. I'm
Yeah. No,
learning
and
a lot about myself.
it's interesting because like, AI for me, like I mean, I'm a big proponent of AI. I mean, I'm biased towards it, but
Yeah,
I'm a big proponent of AI. But it's interesting to see how AI, like you said, how it's gonna change teaching, how it's gonna change the way we like connect through research and do that. So it'll be interesting to see. And so I'm always interested when I talk to professors and academics and understanding how what their perspective is on AI and kind of how that'll really impact not like you said your teaching as well, but your research the research side as well in
yeah.
terms.
It'll be
So
curious, right? Because I mean, a lot of the reason why we see relative age effects boils down to human decision making, right?
yeah.
You're making decisions about what you're observing
Mhm.
with an athlete.
Yeah.
But maybe there are ways through AI in the future where it removes some of that subjectivity and gives you some more objective data
Yeah.
to help inform some decision making. So on that point, this grant that we're working on right now,
Mhm.
we in addition to having the scouts watch the game, we also had all the athletes go through a series of performance testing, on ice performance testing, and so we have those data as well,
Gotcha.
that we can also toy around with and see how that might influence how the scouts evaluate the talent.
Yeah.
It's not our primary research question, but we have those data. We may be able to see how it correlates with their subjective opinions of what they're seeing.
Yeah, that's pretty cool in terms of what you're doing, and even with the relative age effect, the research that you've done, and the impact that it has had, and it's continuing to have, and it will continue to have is interesting, and that's the beautiful thing with research is the continuous impact that it can have on
Absolutely.
not just industry but in academia and in other parts of the world as well. And so before we close the podcast, I always talk to the guests that I have, and like I said to you before I started it, part of my reasoning behind starting this is to provide kind of that inspiration, that source of that for young people, and really for me, it's the success for me is in giving back. Like what can you do to give back? And that's what I've seen you do with your research and reading your research as you're looking to help uh, you're helping younger athletes kind of succeed in their growth. And that's kind of, it resonated with me and kind of why I started this. And so I wanted to give you a chance. This is kind of a two-part question in terms of your giving advice is what advice would you give to somebody trying to break into the sport industry? And then what advice would you give somebody that, because like I told you before, I've had a bunch of students come up to me and talk to me about pursuing graduate education, even at the PhD level as well, a bunch of my
Mhm.
undergrads. What advice would you give to somebody pursuing graduate education in the field of sport management?
Awesome questions. So the first one, in terms of people wanting to break into the industry, get involved,
Yeah.
say yes, show up.
Yeah.
Can't stress enough how much of so many things happen when you're there, right? You meet the right people, you start building your network.
Mhm.
Equally important to who you know and who you've met along the way is who knows you and reaches out to you when an opportunity presents itself. But they won't even know you exist if you're not showing up, if you're not, expressing an interest and following up.
Yeah.
So I think get involved, volunteer.
Mhm.
If you have the opportunity within your education to do an internship or a co-op placement, um, do it. Attend conferences, even if they're virtual. There could be some costs associated with all of these things. But I try to, get my students thinking them not as costs, but as investments. They're investments in your own future,
Yeah.
and they will pay dividends, just like investing in the stock market or whatever the case may be, right? Like if you invest wisely and strategically, don't just invest in everything,
Yeah.
but they will pay dividends and they're investments in yourself. Yes, it may require a little bit of upfront money to travel out of state to go to this conference or stay a night in a hotel or something. But usually, if you can buddy up with a couple of friends, it'll offset the costs of the transportation and
Yeah.
the accommodations and so forth. But get out there, network, get some experiences. You might think you want to be the next general manager of, some professional sports team, but you by speaking with those people and really understanding what that job looks like,
Yeah.
maybe that doesn't align with who you are as a person, what you value. Like if you value, being at home and having dinner with your family every night, that's probably the not the right job for you because you're going to be spending a lot of time on
In
the
the
road
office. Yeah.
and scouting and going to games and traveling and missing your kids' graduations and all those sorts of things. So, understand what those things are and understand what your values are so that when you're starting to identify what kind of career path you want to go down, that it aligns with who you are.
Mhm.
Um, Something might sound really cool, but if it doesn't align with who you are as a person, it's probably not going to last very long.
Yeah. And that's great. I mean, that connection is great because I have an assignment in my intro class that I give is I have them interview their like whatever job that they want potentially in sport. I have them go and interview a professional there and then write and reflect about it in terms of what they learned and, kind of what that is. And from what I found personally is I see students that want to do something and then they either find out that they really want to pursue it or they find out, yeah, this isn't really what I
Oh,
want to, and
complete. I
um,
completely agree.
so it's a great, I mean, I've used that as a tool, as a great assignment in terms of like, especially for my intro kids that like they're freshmen, they're just getting their, feet into the sport management major, really understand, is this really what you want to do? Or because everybody wants, from my students that I heard, it's like a lot of them want to coach, be a GM, be an owner. And I'm like, okay, is that really what you want to like, go and talk to those people, like, and figure out, what it is, what you want to do,
Yeah.
and maybe that is what you want to do. Maybe that is what you want to pursue, but,
Somebody has to do those jobs,
yeah,
right? So I mean,
yeah,
if that's you, then absolutely. But do your homework and the informational interview assignment is a great way to do it. Job shadowing,
yeah,
all those things, anything that you can do to get insight into what those jobs are, will just help students make an informed decision along their journey. And I agree with you. I think some of the worst internship experiences, the worst co-op placements, the most aha moments about a career are some of the best learning experiences because you realize what not to do, what
yeah,
you don't want to be involved with. And that's as important, if not more important, than figuring out what you do want to do.
yeah, no, for sure. And then what advice on the back end of that, what advice would you have to, like I said, I have a bunch of students that want to pursue higher education,
Yeah.
specifically in sport management. What advice would you have for students out there that want to pursue that higher education, whether it be a master's degree or even at the PhD level, students that want to pursue a PhD like you and I did? What advice would you give them?
I think the first thing is get to know your professors.
Mhm.
Take the time, go to the office hours, meet with them, ask them about their research. A lot of, I think back to my own experience as a student, I had no idea what
Mhm.
my professors were doing in terms of their research when I was an undergraduate student. I just knew them as somebody who shows up twice a week and teaches my class.
Yeah.
But, you know, for a lot of academics in our field, teaching might only represent 20 to 40% of their job. In other cases, it could be a little bit more, 60 or 80%, but it
Yeah.
depends on the institution. But for a lot of people, research is a big part of their job, but students are usually not exposed to it. So,
Mhm.
if you have a professor who you like the content that they're teaching, usually their research interests are going to be somewhat aligned with that.
Yeah.
Go to their online profiles and see what their research interests are. Sometimes it'll have their CV, which is just a resume essentially that has a listing of their research outputs, and then you can go and look up some of those journal articles and read about them.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a starting point, and then ask them like, can you tell me about what your research is? And if you like what you hear, ask if you can get involved. Maybe at the start, maybe you're just a research participant and trying to understand the research process.
Mhm.
But then maybe from there you become a volunteer on a project, and maybe when you get into third or fourth year, you could do an undergraduate thesis or an independent study or something with that professor, where you're taking a little, piece of their research, or maybe it's a project that you come up with on your own and
Mhm.
carry it out from beginning to end.
Yeah.
Um, but try to get an idea of, just like with the other things we were talking about for working in the industry, do you like that? Do you like the idea of creating new knowledge and contributing to what students are reading about in their textbooks and learning about in their classes? Because that's the potential that you have with research, is you're building new knowledge that becomes the basis for decision making in industry and education and schools, or whatever area that you're interested in. So I
Yeah.
think that's the first thing I would say is talk to your professors. They're most likely doing research, or they've done research at some level, and ask if there's opportunities to get involved.
And that's
From there,
the correlation there with, like you said, the industry and in academia. The big piece is showing up, being involved, being there.
um,
That's the key
yeah,
uh, for students. And it's, yeah, like, getting professors are, I always tell students, I'm not gonna bite. You come talk to me. I'm not gonna, I'm a nice guy. Like, I'm not
of
doing,
course.
like, you can always come talk to me. And
Yeah,
it's always interesting to see how many students actually show up to office hours when the office hours are there. And I always keep the door open. Always, whenever students want to come in, can come in. And it's always interesting to kind of see um,
yeah.
how many students actually utilize that and help that out. And so it's like you said, just get involved, maybe like you said, you're a research participant, understanding, because it's important to understand that research process as well. And before you can really dive in. So it's great to see that. But that's
And then
all.
I think for people who are interested in going on,
Yeah.
um, you know, again, do your homework. I mean, figure out what it, if you want to go on and do a PhD, then you're probably going to want to look at more of a thesis-based program where you can get the opportunity to develop more of those research skills. And in that case, identifying an advisor who has similar interests and who
Mhm.
you think you can work with one-on-one.
Mhm.
I can't stress enough how important those relationships are, because there are going to be difficult times along the way as a master's student and as a doctoral student. You want to make sure you have someone in your corner that's going to support you along the way, and in some cases push you and give you the kick in the rear end that you might need to do the work that's necessary to get through it. But
Yep.
those relationships are so critically important. So that's where attending academic conferences can come in really handy.
Yep.
And there's opportunities to do that as a student, even as an undergraduate student, to get involved in some of those different academic conferences and build your network that way.
For sure, for sure. But that's all the time we have for this episode of the Athlete Insights podcast. Again, Dr. Jess Dixon, I appreciate you taking the time and spending the time with me, spending the time and giving your insights and your wisdom. And I know I'm appreciative. I know students, as we um, send this information out and distribute this information, I know students will be grateful and thankful for all the wisdom and all the advice. And so appreciate you taking the time. I'll have your social media up on the video. I'll have your social media and you on the YouTube description as well. So if those of you watch this video enjoy hearing about Dr. Dixon's research and what he does, you can follow his social media online and follow his journey and his career at the University of Windsor and beyond. And You can follow my podcast on YouTube, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, pretty much everywhere you get podcasts, you can find this one. But appreciate you taking the time, and we'll see you next time.